Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my top 40 full PPR wide receiver rankings for our upcoming 2025 fantasy football draft. Now, about a week ago, I talked about my top 40 wide receiver rankings for a half PPR scoring format. So I wanted to go ahead and update the format as we have seen a full week's worth of training camp and preseason games. So I'll talk about these players on an individual basis, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions, and of course statistics that justify these rankings, so that as you approach your upcoming draft, you can make the correct decisions and help yourself win a 2025 fantasy football championship. Now, before we get into today's content, for those of you guys who are looking for my thoughts on a specific player, you can travel down to the description of the video. We have timestamps available there. While you're down there, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel, as we're making daily fantasy football content with the singular goal of helping you win 2025 fantasy football championships. Final piece of information before we get into talking about these 40 wide receivers. For those of you guys who want to grant yourself an advantage, not only for your upcoming drafts, but for every single Sunday for the remainder of the season, be sure to travel down to the description and check out Betr. I'll be partnering with them for the entirety of the 2025 season, not only providing plays and putting my predictions to the test, but of course providing rankings every single week for the remainder of the season. If you go ahead and sign up using code Andrew today, make that first time deposit minimum of $10 and make that first time play minimum of $1 within the sports realm, you go ahead and get my rankings sent for my email directly to yours. These rankings in regards to the draft rankings over the course of the month of August, updated weekly, by position, by tier, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, and flex at a top 200 rate in regards to half and full PPR. So for those of you interested in getting those rankings, and of course, subsequent rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, be sure to go ahead, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your current location. And if you play up to $10 today, you'll get up to $30 instantly. Again, whether it's the MLB, whether it's potentially NFL preseason, or even week one of the NFL, we'll go ahead and share a couple plays over the course of today's episode. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's go ahead and let's talk about my top 40 wide receiver rankings for a full PPR scoring format, beginning with our number one. Again, it's an easy answer. The first player that should come off the board in full PPR leagues, that's Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. Last season, from weeks 3 through 18, averaging 10.93 targets per game and 25.55 fantasy points per game. The reason why I specifically talk about weeks 3 through 18 is because he did not participate in any of the training camp this time last year. Due to the contract negotiations that he was going through, his first 2 weeks of the 2024 season were pretty much his warm-up. But once he got warm, he was unstoppable. And regardless of whether or not T. Higgins was on the field, was a impactful fantasy asset that led many of us to a 2024 championship. Even in the games in which he played with T. Higgins last season, the 12 games, he was still averaging 24.68 fantasy points per game. Going into 2025, the Bengals are expected to be in a lot of shootouts, especially considering from weeks 9 through 18, their defense was allowing 25.7 points per game, which forced the Bengals offense between weeks 9 through 18 to average 30.8 points per game. Ridiculous statistics. Again, he's the number one wide receiver associated with one of the best quarterbacks in the league. Don't make it more difficult than it has to be. Select Ja'Marr Chase with a 1.01. All right, our number two is Justin Jefferson. Now, this offseason, of course, we all know that he's been dealing with a hamstring injury, but he's certainly been making progress. I saw a video of him yesterday morning in which he was running full speed at training camp. Sure, he is not participating in the practice, but running off to the side. As long as he continues to trend in the right direction, we're still 27 days away from the week one matchup Monday Night Football against the Chicago Bears. So we still have a lot of time between now and then for him to be healthy and at 100% rate. And of course, build that rapport with JJ McCarthy, because certainly that is going to be important. Because when we look at the opportunity share of Justin Jefferson in 2022 and 2023, he was averaging 11.2 and 11.4 targets per game. This most recent season, only 9.1 targets per game when healthy. If we go ahead and look at his fantasy point per target averages over the course of the last 3 seasons, they have stayed consistent with 2.02, 2.11, and 2.06. So under the assumption that he stays within the averages that he was able to maintain last season with a 2.06 fantasy point per target average, if he's able to elevate back to his 11 targets per game, we're talking about an additional 4.12 fantasy points per game on average, which would elevate him to being a 23-point scorer in a full PPR scoring format. You know, with Jordan Addison suspended for the first 3 games, Hawkinson maybe not as involved as we may have believed, Jefferson should be able to get himself those 10 plus targets per game going forward with McCarthy. Number 3, to close out the S tier, we have CeeDee Lamb, who over the course of the last 2 seasons has been targeted on 29% of the routes that he has ran, regardless of quarterback. And why I mention regardless of quarterback is because whether it was Dak Prescott or Cooper Rush last season, he was incredible, averaging 10.3 targets per game with both quarterbacks 18.86 with Dak, 18.36 with Cooper Rush. So regardless of who's playing quarterback, CeeDee Lamb is an elite wide receiver and is going to elevate the quarterback position, even while he was dealing with a shoulder injury last season. Now, in terms of his 17-game pace from 2024, we're talking about 314 fantasy points in a full PPR. Any wide receiver over the course of the last 5 NFL seasons that has been able to surpass 300 fantasy points in a full PPR has been automatic top 5, which, of course, that's why we have CeeDee Lamb in this conversation going into 2025. Our number 4, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's been the number 3 overall wide receiver in a full PPR in back-to-back seasons. This most recent year, averaging 8.3 targets per game, which again is far less than we have seen in the past. But again, it had to do with the fact that this offense was incredibly run-heavy. Amongst all teams in the National Football League, they had the 3rd highest rushing rate when you compare quarterback passing attempts and running back rushing attempts combined. So if in fact we're going to be in a situation in which we're going to see far more balanced game scripts with less rushing and potentially more passing and hopefully more targets in the direction of Amon-Ra St. Brown, then of course he's going to be that much more relevant for fantasy purposes and hopefully can increase his fantasy point upside similar to what he was able to produce in 2023. With this all being said, I still do anticipate to see regression from Amon-Ra St. Brown, specifically within the touchdown category, having scored 12 last season, 9 of which were scored inside the 10-yard line, which was number 1 amongst all receiving options last season. So with that number probably regressing, but the reception count and hopefully yardage increasing, that should balance him out and at least continue to keep him within the top 4 conversation. Number 5, we have Malik Nabers. Look, Malik Nabers is a special talent. Last season, when healthy from weeks 1 through 18, 11.33 targets per game. He led all receiving options in 2024 in terms of targets per game on average, which led to 18.24 fantasy points per game. Now, the question is, can he improve upon his incredible rookie season? And the data shows that he is absolutely going to improve his fantasy point per game production. From 2020 to 2023, first-round selected NFL wide receivers, there have been 21 of them total. 16 of them had a healthy second year of their career. 15 of those 16 wide receivers had a fantasy point per game increase in their second season, which includes wide receivers such as Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. We've all witnessed what Malik Nabers is capable of. He's going to be able to join Chase and Jefferson in that LSU club of wide receivers that is going to continue to improve every single season. The fact that you go ahead and you bring in quarterback improvements and the fact that Nabers is making his own improvements as a wide receiver going from year 1 to year 2, as long as he continues to get, just like he was last season, targeted on 31% of the routes that he was running. Ridiculous number. As long as that number continues to stay in that position, should be fantastic for fantasy purposes. But speaking of fantasy purposes, or potentially even week 1 of this upcoming season, for those of you who are interested in potentially making a play via Betr, when you go ahead and you find Malik Nabers in the wide receiver section, his number for week 1 in terms of 69.5 receiving yards, I truly do believe that the implementation and the association with Russell Wilson is going to elevate him immediately, taking on the Washington Commanders in a negative game script for probably the entirety of this game. I'd anticipate him to crush that number of 69.5 receiving yards. So for those of you who are interested, go ahead and make that play today via Betr. Use code Andrew. Thank you very much. Let's go ahead and let's move on to the next wide receiver, which is number 6, Nico Collins. Now, last season when healthy, Nico Collins from weeks 1 through 20, including the NFL playoffs, was averaging 9.2 targets per game and 19 fantasy points per game in a full PPR scoring format. And even in the 2 games in which he left early due to an injury, he had scored 30.6 full PPR fantasy points in just 20 snaps of play. That's in week 5 and 18. 20 snaps leading to 30.6 fantasy points. He is a wide receiver that is undoubtedly capable of finishing as the number 1 by the end of the 2025 season if he can stay healthy. In the first 3 seasons of his career, he has missed consistent time, which has certainly hurt his fantasy stock in comparison to all these other wide receivers, who he is certainly capable of scoring more fantasy points than on a per week basis. I mean, if you just go ahead and look at the 19 fantasy points per game he scored last season, I mean, that's better than Amon-Ra, that's better than Malik Nabers, that's better than CeeDee Lamb, that's better than Justin Jefferson last year. So if in fact he's going to be in a situation in which he gets more opportunity with Nick Caley coming in, their new offensive coordinator, the former passing game coordinator of the LA Rams. We all know the Sean McVay tree leading to Taylor, LaFleur, O'Connell, Cohen, all finding success in the NFL. If you were to increase Nico Collins' target share from 9 targets to 11 targets per game on average, with a 2.16 fantasy point per target average, he could very easily score 24 fantasy points per game this season on average at a base minimum, which certainly could be number 1 overall when it's all said and done. The final wide receiver within this tier is Puka Nacua that I wanted to mention. Again, this time last week, I had Puka Nacua in a half PPR within the S tier as my number 4 because he certainly has the capabilities of elevating to that level. But with recent news of Matthew Stafford still not practicing with the back injury, which again is something that we need to monitor. And as the days go on, I'm beginning to grow more and more concerned regarding the health of Matthew Stafford and his availability in 2025. I'm traumatized from, the elbow injury from a couple years ago. Eventually, Matthew Stafford gets banged up enough within that season in which, unfortunately, they have to shut him down. I'm hoping that's not the case because I don't really want to rely upon Jimmy Garoppolo with Puka Nacua. But let's hope Stafford can get healthy and get back on the field so I can increase the ranking of Puka going forward. A wide receiver that last season from weeks 8 through 17 averaged 21.81 fantasy points per game in a full PPR. Amongst all wide receivers last season, was targeted on 38.13% of the total routes that he ran, which is the highest amongst all wide receivers in the last 19 years. He also was able to accomplish the third highest yards per route run average over the course of the last 2 decades of the NFL, which is only behind Tyreek Hill and Steve Smith Sr. So again, a lot of talent, a lot of potential, just needs a healthy quarterback, and he'll dominate at a top 5 capacity. Now, before we continue, for those of you guys who are looking for my 2025 fantasy football draft guide, which includes many of the statistics and, of course, strategies in which you can approach your upcoming drafts, be sure to go ahead, travel down to the description and check out the Patreon. Not only will you be able to get access to the 2025 draft guide, you'll get my rankings, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings, ask me unlimited questions, and, of course, get Discord server access. So for those of you interested, be sure to check that out today. Like always, I greatly appreciate all the support. Thank you. All right, so let's go ahead and let's move on. To our number 8, we have Brian Thomas Jr., another one of these second-year wide receivers that are going to make a jump. Because like I mentioned with Malik Nabers, since 2020, when we talk about first-round NFL drafted wide receivers, there have been 21 total, 16 who played a healthy second year of their career. 15 of those 16 had fantasy point per game increases in year 2. We talked about Malik Nabers joining the club of Chase and Jefferson as LSU wide receivers that make that jump in year 2. This time around, it's going to be Nabers and BTJ, former LSU wide receivers, who are going to make incredible jumps this upcoming season. Now, last time we saw BTJ playing from weeks 10 through 18 was unstoppable because he was given ample opportunity. 10 targets per game with Mac Jones, leading to 19.25 fantasy points per game. I'm hoping that Liam Cohen, the new offensive play caller and head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars, is going to elevate him, especially considering Liam Cohen this offseason has said, and quote, "Our passing game will run through Brian Thomas Jr." So if he's going to utilize BTJ as the Mike Evans of this offense, we got to remember last season, Mike Evans, when healthy, 17.76 fantasy points per game. BTJ, at a base minimum, should be capable of accomplishing that, if not more. Number 9 is Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. Now, last season from weeks 1 through 15 with Kirk Cousins, a fantastic player, 15.45 fantasy points per game on 9 targets per game, but took a huge jump forward with Michael Penix because Michael Penix continued to funnel the ball in his direction. 13 targets per game for the final 3 games of the season, leading to a 23.07 fantasy point per game average in a full PPR. Only once last season was he able to eclipse 100 receiving yards with Kirk Cousins, was able to accomplish that twice in 3 games with Michael Penix, considering he had a 39% target share within the offense when Penix was under center. Again, Puka levels of production because he is getting himself an offensive coordinator that is, again, learned from the McVay tree, but not only that, he is getting himself a lot of slot utilization. Last season was number 4 amongst all receiving options in terms of targets from the slot, targeted on 33% of those slot routes. As long as that opportunity share continues to be there, there really isn't much competition within this offense to stop Drake London from once again being a top 10 wide receiver for fantasy purposes, if not better. Number 10. We have A.J. Brown. Now, this 2024 campaign for A.J. Brown, even though the Eagles season ended in the Super Bowl, for fantasy purposes, again, was the lowest targets per game on average that he has received since joining the Eagles in 2022. Only averaged 7.75 targets per game, but still was able to score 17.61 fantasy points per game. Now, we're hoping going into this year with potentially a less effective Saquon Barkley in rushing attack, there's going to be more opportunities within the passing game. And considering last season's A.J. Brown production led to a 2.27 fantasy point per target average, which again is the most amongst all the wide receivers that I have gone ahead and seen as of late, If we increase his 7.75 targets to maybe 9.8 targets per game on average, we're talking about a 22.25 fantasy point per game potential for someone like A.J. Brown, who last season in games in which he had 9 or more targets scored a minimum of 22.5 fantasy points in each of those 4 games. With opportunity comes success. We're hoping that the Eagles continue to look in his direction far more often in 2025. Number 11 to close out this year is Tyreek Hill. Look, prior to 2024, he was ranked in the top 6 for fantasy purposes in 4 consecutive seasons. And with a healthy Tua Tagovailoa back in 2023, was averaging 10 targets per game. Ample opportunity for an elite wide receiver. This most recent year, only 7.91 targets per game in the 11 games that he played with Tua. And even though the numbers have dropped significantly in terms of the target percentage, and based on the overall routes ran, only 23% in comparison to 32% in 2022 and 36% in 2023, I'm hoping that the departure of Jonnu Smith, who was garnering late last season about 7 to 8 targets per game on average, I'm hoping a lot of those targets can go in the direction of guys like Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle, who certainly are the lifeblood of this offense and who McDaniel really needs to step up in order for this offense to continue to string together wins this upcoming season. We know the potential of Tyreek Hill. We know that he's one of the best fantasy wide receivers of all time. Just need to get him more opportunity this year. Hopefully everyone's healthy within the Dolphins offense. Number 12, we have Ladd McConkey. Now, over the course of the last couple of days, many of you in the comment section have asked, Andrew, what are your thoughts on Keenan Allen and his impact upon Ladd McConkey's potential upside this upcoming season? I've gone ahead and I've gathered my thoughts over the course of the last couple of days, and my expectation is that Keenan Allen was brought in not to play the slot receiving role at an exclusive capacity. In fact, I do anticipate him to play on the outside a lot more this upcoming season than we have ever seen Keenan Allen play within a Chargers uniform. And that's primarily because Ladd McConkey was unstoppable within the slot position last season. And late last year really took over from weeks 11 through 19, averaging 9 targets per game and 20.68 fantasy points per game in a full PPR. In terms of his slot usage, he was able to surpass all of Keenan Allen's 2023 numbers in 2024. He was number 5 in terms of slot targets amongst all receiving options, 5 in receptions, 2nd in yards, and 4th in receiving touchdowns. So as we approach this upcoming season, I don't anticipate Keenan Allen's presence to be a negative going forward for Ladd McConkey, as I still anticipate him to be a top 12 option for a 2nd consecutive year for fantasy purposes. All right, let's move on to number 13. We have T. Higgins. Look, T. Higgins and his major issue for his career has been injuries. He has missed 15 games due to injury since 2021, and he certainly has the potential of being a top 12 ranked wide receiver if he can stay fully healthy in 2025. Because late last year, post-injury from weeks 11 through 18, he averaged 9.14 targets per game and 20.14 fantasy points per game. Considering he is associated within an offense that has so many dynamic weapons with Jamar Chase, Chase Brown, Mike Gesicki, Noah Fant, Joe Burrow, you have so many threats within this offense. Considering they're going to be in so many shootouts this year, their defense late last season, weeks 9 through 18, allowing 25.7 points per game. Their offense having to rebuttal with a 30.8 point per game average. There's a very high potential in which this offense leads the league in scoring. And there's a very high potential in which Joe Burrow could go for a 50 touchdown season. If he does, then we'll have both Chase and T. Higgins within the top 6 category. But until then, as long as T. Higgins is able to maybe play 15 games this season, I think the number 13 spot is perfect. Number 14, we talked about the thumbnail of today's episode. We have Jaxon Smith-Njigba, the number 1 receiving option, undeniably, of the Seattle Seahawks. Now, last season, even though he still was the number 1 receiving option of that offense, he still only got himself 8.06 targets per game for 14.88 fantasy points per game. He had 7 games last season of 6 or fewer targets and still was able to accumulate 100 receptions last year. And now that he is the clear and away number 1 receiving option, and he is going to get more targets going into this upcoming season, considering he's the best slot receiving option in the National Football League back in 2024, with number 1 in terms of targets, receptions, and receiving yards of the category, Clint Kubiak is going to set him up for success. With Sam Darnold looking in his direction, funnel targeting him for a majority of games, I do anticipate to see this offense run just primarily 2 wide receiver sets and run a lot of play action, a lot of pre-snap motions, which is going to allow a lot of available options and opportunities for Jaxon Smith-Njigba to be the designed, pass catcher of individual plays. They want him to get the ball in space and make plays on a consistent basis. That certainly will occur this upcoming season, especially in a full PPR capacity. The next tier of player begins with Mike Evans, who again we all know has been unstoppable. 11 consecutive seasons of 1,000 receiving yards. He has been a top 17 ranked fantasy wide receiver in 9 consecutive seasons for full PPR. He has never ranked below wide receiver 23 in a full PPR scoring format. So going into this year, considering the injury concerns of Chris Godwin, and of course, how well Mike Evans was able to produce last season, 17.76 fantasy points per game on average, we do anticipate to see Baker Mayfield continue to lean in his direction, continue to lean towards his comfort receiving option, who again, isn't slowing down anytime soon. Mike Evans has practically become the Derrick Henry of the receiver position, consistently in that top 12 conversation. And if you're just looking for consistent production on a yearly basis and want to just have a safe wide receiver selection, Mike Evans is your guy this upcoming season. Number 16, we have DK Metcalf. Look, DK Metcalf is probably one of my favorite wide receivers this season based on what his current ADP is and where I have him ranked. I mean, when you go ahead and just talk about the fact that he is now associated with Aaron Rodgers, that makes a huge difference for fantasy purposes. I don't care about what Aaron Rodgers is going to do within the win columns. All I know is that he is going to be sending the ball in the direction of DK Metcalf 30% of the overall routes that he is running. That is a given. I mean, again, if this offense is going to be throwing the ball about 520 times this upcoming season, which again, we have seen the 2023 Falcons with Arthur Smith as their play caller throw the ball 528 times back in 2023. Based on Russell Wilson's week 17 through 18 passing attempts per game average, that's a 17-game pace of 520. We could very easily see DK Metcalf come away with 156 targets, which again is 30% of the target share of this offense. And honestly, that's just the base minimum that I'm expecting to see. When we just talk about Aaron Rodgers and his number one receiving options from 2008 to 2024, I mean, we're talking about his number one options averaging 90 receptions, 1,200 receiving yards, and 10 touchdowns per season. I mean, just this most recent year, Garrett Wilson, weeks 1 through 6, averaged 16.2 fantasy points per game in a full PPR. Davante Adams from week 7 through 18, 18 fantasy points per game. DK Metcalf should be in line to probably split the difference with the 17 point per game average in a full PPR this season. Number 17, we have Courtland Sutton, who after the debacle of that Thursday night game against the Saints in week 7 of the 2024 year, from weeks 8 through 19, the offense completely changed and continued to send the ball in the direction consistently towards Courtland Sutton, in which he had 8.82 targets per game and 17.96 fantasy points per game. Throughout that span of time, was targeted in terms of percentages, 25.33% of the routes that he was running, a 2.29 yards per route run average, was number 2 amongst all wide receivers in terms of air yards, only behind Calvin Ridley throughout that span of time. Deep down the field was number 9 in terms of most targets, 20 or more yards down the field at the position. We are anticipating the number 1 receiving threat of this offense, the number 1 red zone threat of this offense to continue to be relevant as the Broncos continue to ascend in the 2025 calendar year. Number 18, we have Davante Adams. Matthew Stafford is just not healthy. And every day, my concern grows considering his back injury. A back injury, again, if he gets hit the wrong way this upcoming season, we could have Jimmy Garoppolo throwing hospital balls for the entire year there. And that is something that I am not interested in. Therefore, I am very cautious with Adams until I get further information that is confidence boosting in regards to Stafford's health. Even though Adams has been a top 10 wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game on average in 6 of the last 7 seasons, and he is going to elevate whatever quarterback he plays with, I am still very much so going to play safe with it. I think number 18 is structured perfectly, even after Davante Adams late last season from weeks 9 through 18, was averaging 20.11 fantasy points per game with Aaron Rodgers. The quarterback play is certainly going to make the biggest differential within the upcoming season's performance. Number 19, we have DJ Moore. Look, in the post-Shane Waldron era, once they fired Shane Waldron as their OC last season, from weeks 11 through 18, 9.25 targets per game, and was incorporated on a lot of opportunities in which he was getting the ball close to the line of scrimmage on screen passes just to get the ball in his hands to make plays after the catch, which led to a 17.3 fantasy point per game average. Again, he wasn't targeted less than 7 targets in any game throughout those 8 games and had a minimum of 6 receptions per game. So if in fact Ben Johnson is going to utilize DJ Moore in a very similar capacity in which they are designing plays to get the ball in his hands, whether it's pre-snap motions, whether it's screen passes, whether it's him lining up out of the backfield as the running back, it doesn't matter what it is, they're going to continue to utilize him at a high capacity as their number 1 receiving option. Number 2, we have Garrett Wilson. Look, Garrett Wilson weeks 1 through 9 pre-Davante Adams takeover. 10.44 targets per game, 17.42 fantasy points per game, and we're hoping for a similar level of opportunity. Sure, maybe his fantasy point production won't be as high end, But in terms of the opportunity share, we're hoping that he's going to get himself 9 to 10 targets per game. And with Justin Fields, we have recently seen when he has been the number one quarterback of the Bears in 2023, DJ Moore was averaging only 8.25 targets per game with him. Still, 19.77 fantasy points per game, which is very promising. And Fields and Garrett Wilson have a rapport as they both played together at Ohio State in 2019 and 2020. We're hoping that the Jets aren't going to be an offense that are going to have the lowest passing attempts in 2025, even though it is leaning in that direction prior to the season beginning, because it looks like they're going to be a run-only team. Now, regardless of how the scheme is going to function or quarterback play, Garrett Wilson has still been able to manage to have himself 1,000 receiving yards in each of his first 3 seasons, even with quarterbacks like Zach Wilson. I think Justin Fields is an upgrade, therefore Garrett Wilson should still be top 20 relevant. Terry McLaurin is our number 1. Again, we still don't have clear information regarding how his contract negotiations are going. Of course, he recently requested a trade, and we're hoping that they're going to re-sign him sooner rather than later. Again, he's coming off the most successful season of his career because he finally played with a actually good quarterback. And even though he was averaging 7.25 fantasy points per game from weeks 3 through 21, including the playoffs, he still was only averaging 7.11 targets per game. We're going to anticipate his regression because he is not at camp, and he scored 13 receiving touchdowns last year, 10 of which came within the red zone on only 14 red zone targets. Regression is a base minimum for Terry McLaurin, whether he signs right now or signs in 2 weeks. Number 22, we have Xavier Worthy. For those of you who are looking for my thoughts on Rashee Rice, let me just go ahead and share them really quickly. I am anticipating Rashee Rice to likely be suspended before the season. The anticipation is a minimum of 4 to 6 games. If that does take place, then Xavier Worthy continues to maintain this number 22 standing because, again, that is enough of a significant spectrum of time to elevate Worthy to this capacity, even though he's not going to be able to sustain the fantasy point upside that he has to the beginning of the year. Now, late last season, when he was able to break out, the fantasy point per game upside that I'm referring to is about 17.5 fantasy points per game, which he was able to accomplish. As one of the fastest receivers in the league and the Chiefs trying to reintegrate their deep ball passing threat, I am hoping that if we are going to see Rashee Rice miss some time early on, then Xavier Worthy can step up to the task on hand and deliver for fantasy purposes early in the year. Then maybe we can ship him off or continue to utilize his services for the remainder of the season. But if Rice ends up not being suspended, he's a top 15 wide receiver in a full PPR capacity, if not better. Number 23, we have Marvin Harrison Jr. Yes, he did not live up to expectations in year 1, but there was a shift late last season from weeks 13 through 18. If you guys remember, prior to week's 13 game against the Minnesota Vikings, the offensive coordinator, the head coach, they both came out and they said prior to the game that we anticipate to get more targets in the direction of Marvin Harrison Jr. And that's exactly what they did for the remainder of the year, averaging 8.33 targets per game, which on a 17-game pace is 142 targets, which last season amongst all wide receivers would have ranked him 8th. Opportunity leads to success in fantasy football. So as long as he's able to get himself close to 140 targets this year and maintain that target opportunity share that he had late last season, then of course his fantasy relevancy will continue to grow and hopefully keep him in the top 24 conversation at a base minimum. Number 24, we have Tetairoa McMillan, who should be cleared away the number 1 target getter of the Panthers offense. I talked about this in a video the other day in which I have McMillan as my thumbnail. As the number 1 target getter of his offense, as a first round selected wide receiver within the top 10 picks of his NFL draft, he should have a base minimum average about 13.1 full PPR fantasy points per game, if not 15 plus fantasy points this upcoming season. As Dave Canales has been quoted to say, he's going to get targeted a lot. We're going to throw a lot at him this upcoming season. With 0 target competition outside of a 35-year-old Adam Thielen, I expect McMillan to be the Mike Evans of this offense, which should lead to hopefully somewhere between 135 to 140 targets this upcoming season. Number 25, we have Jameson Williams, who over the course of the last couple weeks continues to gain hype in training camp based on what the coaching staff continues to say about him. And as we are approaching an upcoming season for the Lions, in which they may be in more balanced game scripts, more passing, hopefully more opportunities are looked in the direction of Jameson Williams, who only averaged 6.07 targets per game, yet over 14 fantasy points per game last season. Now, if in fact he gets more targets and receptions and receiving yards, fantastic, because if the opportunities are there, it will grant him more potential of big playmaking ability, because last season he had touchdowns of 61, 42, 82, 64, 37, 70, and 52 yards. He's a big playmaker. Give him the opportunities, and of course, he's going to deliver for fantasy purposes. The next wide receiver I wanted to mention is DeVonta Smith, who, very similar to A.J. Brown, is not given enough opportunity considering how effective they have been. Last season when healthy, 6.85 targets per game, but 15.34 fantasy points per game, the lowest target per game average he has seen since 2022. Despite the lack of opportunity, he was still able to score over 11 fantasy points in a full PPR in 10 of his 13 healthy games. And we're hoping that, of course, a less effective Saquon Barkley could lead to more opportunity share within the passing game. If we can increase his target per game, about 2 targets per game, we're talking about the potential of DeVonta Smith entering into a top 15 wide receiver conversation, maybe even top 12 like he did a couple years ago. Again, a 2.24 fantasy point per target average could elevate him with only 8.85 targets to about 20 fantasy points per game, under the assumption that, of course, he is given that kind of an opportunity share this season. Number 27 is Jakobi Meyers, who is ranked as the number 33, 28, 24, and 23 overall wide receiver in a full PPR over the course of the last 3 seasons. In this most recent year, averaged 15 fantasy points per game post Davante Adams leaving the Raiders organization. So if we're going to get a quarterback upgrade, I mean, again, you got to remember in the last 2 seasons, Myers has played with Minshew, O'Connell, Ritter, Garoppolo, and Hoyer. Now you get Geno Smith, who we all know is certainly capable enough to elevate Jakobi Meyers far past the number 27 standing, which again, fingers crossed, he's going to be able to do after, of course, Brock Bowers gets all of his targets and utilization. Number 28, I have Ricky Pearsall. The way that I see it, there really isn't very much target competition for Ricky Pearsall. Post Deebo Samuel trade, post Brandon Ayuk ACL, injury. Again, Brandon Ayuk, the most recent report was, he'll be ready by week 6. I'm anticipating him probably to not be ready until maybe week 8, 9, depending on where their bye week lands. I'm anticipating them to kind of just take it slow. They don't need to rush him back, as they'll have Pearsall dominating as their clear and away number 1. All training camp long, we have heard that he is the clear number 1, with Jauan Jennings obviously sitting out with a calf injury, with George Kittle not being able to get over 95 targets in a single season since 2019. Expect Ricky Pearsall to get the vast majority of targets, which he did last season in weeks 17 and 18. In those 2 weeks, 24.7 and 15.9 fantasy points. 10 targets against the Lions and 8 targets against the Arizona Cardinals. I would anticipate Ricky Pearsall, the former first-round pick, to absolutely be fantasy relevant this season. Number 29, we have Calvin Ridley, who I think the number 29 spot may be 10 ranks too low, and I'm going to tell you exactly why. He was able to maintain the number 28 overall wide receiver standing last season because he was healthy, of course, played a full season, with Levis and Rudolph, who were the 6th lowest passing rate accuracy amongst all quarterback tandems and groups all of last season. So if you're still able to average last season from weeks 8 through 18, 14 fantasy points per game, and now you go ahead and you add a relevant quarterback to the conversation after a season in which he led the league in terms of total air yards, number 7 amongst all wide receivers in terms of average depth of target, if these numbers continue to stay as such, we have seen rookie wide receivers who were drafted in the last 2 seasons elevate their number 1 receiving options. Stroud, Young, Nix, Daniels, and Williams elevated their number 1 wide receivers to number 12, 17, 15, 7, and 16. Therefore, we are anticipating for Calvin Ridley to be once again relevant within this upcoming season, considering the association with a far improved quarterback for the Tennessee Titans. Number 30 is Zay Flowers. Look, in the last 2 seasons, he's ranked as number 31 and 25. This most recent season, averaging about 12.9 fantasy points per game. If he was to have stayed healthy for the entire year, would have been even higher ranked because, again, he is just consistent. He's not an explosive player. He is not going to completely change your singular week with one performance because, again, he doesn't have much of a touchdown target share. Only 10.26% of Lamar Jackson's 41 touchdowns went in the direction of Zay Flowers. But 26% of his target share, 27% of the yardage share went in his direction, which again is very much so confidence boosting. But until Zay Flowers scores a consistent volume of touchdowns, he sits here at the number 30 ranking, in which he has the potential of being about 30 to 24, depending on how the season goes. Number 31 is Jerry Jeudy, who again, with Jameis Winston, with competent quarterback play last season, was averaging 17.6 fantasy points per game, a 24% target share, 9.87 targets per game. Cleveland Browns amongst all teams last season, number 4 in terms of wide receiver targets. Jeudy ran the most routes amongst all wide receivers last year. He'll have either Joe Flacco or Shedeur Sanders, who both look solid. And I mean, with Joe Flacco probably starting the season, and we got to remember, back in 2023, in the final 5 games in which he played with the Browns, including the playoffs, we saw Amari Cooper average 20-plus fantasy points per game with Flacco. So Flacco reintegrated within this offense. Why not Jeudy this upcoming season as a top 30 option potentially? Number 32, we have Travis Hunter. I mentioned this a couple days ago in the video in which I talked about, rookie wide receivers and second-year studs. Travis Hunter, again, selected as a top 10 selection. When we look at other top 10 selected wide receivers in their respective NFL draft since 2020, we have seen a total of 8 wide receivers have full healthy seasons of 15 or more games. 7 of those 8 wide receivers ranked within the top 36. The only wide receiver that wasn't capable of accomplishing that was Rome Odunze because he was the number 3 target getter of his offense. Travis Hunter is clear and away going to be the number 2 target getter right behind BTJ. And with that, we do anticipate an average of about 130 targets, 80 catches, 1,000 yards, 6 touchdowns. If we're going to see Travis Hunter accumulate that kind of level of receiving upside, of course, top 32 is a base minimum, especially considering how involved he was playing 11 of the 12 first-team offensive snaps with the Jaguars in their first preseason game. Had himself 2 targets, 2 receptions, 9 receiving yards, 62.5% slot usage, but he also had a target that was called back due to an offensive penalty. So he had himself 3 targets very quickly within the offense. They are designing to get the ball out of the hands of Lawrence quickly and hopefully in the direction of their top receiving option within the slot. We have recently seen Liam Cohen's offenses in 2024 and 2022 elevate Godwin and Cooper Kupp to astronomical levels. Maybe Travis Hunter is going to have himself a ridiculous year 1 of his career. Number 33, we have George Pickens. Look, George Pickens has played with Pickett, Trubisky, Rudolph, Fields, and Russell Wilson. Again, not great quarterbacks. Dak Prescott is by far and away the best quarterback he will ever play with up until now. And considering we have seen, a lot of the overall opportunities that have gone in the direction of Pickens be lackluster, about 29% of them deemed uncatchable in the last 3 seasons. When we're talking about Dak Prescott being the 5th most accurate quarterback in terms of passes 10 or more yards down the field, we are anticipating George Pickens to be relevant. Sure, he's going to still be the number 2, if not number 3 receiving option of this offense, certainly behind Lamb, but always competing with Jake Ferguson considering how much Dak likes to utilize the tight end position. Our number 34 is Stefon Diggs, who again is making the quickest recovery in ACL history and is expected to have himself a solid year as the number 1 receiving option of this offense. We have seen McDaniel's offenses consist of boosting guys like Davante Adams to being the number 1 with 180 targets. We saw in 2021, Jakobi Meyers 126 in terms of his total targets. Hopefully, we're going to see a volume of 130 plus targets in the direction of Stefon Diggs, who last season, pre-injury, was averaging nearly 16 fantasy points per game in a full PPR scoring format. Number 35, we have Rome Odunze, a former top 10 overall selected wide receiver in the 2024 NFL Draft. We talked about it earlier when we talk about first-round selected wide receivers who had full healthy year 2s. 15 of those 16 wide receivers made improvements within their fantasy point per game averages. I do anticipate to see a drastic improvement in terms of his fantasy point per game average. Last season, only averaging about 8 fantasy points per game. So hopefully it's not going to be just him jumping to 11, but him rather jumping to a 13, 14 fantasy point per game average, because again, we know he has the talent and he certainly can be in the top tier of this conversation. We know that he's associated with an offensive coordinator like Ben Johnson, who is going to hopefully get him into the Jameson Williams kind of jump and hopefully get him within the top 30 standings. Number 36 is Jaylen Waddle, currently dealing with an injury. Again, last season riddled with injuries, Tua riddled with injuries. Even when they both played together healthy, only 5.67 targets per game, only targeted on 17% of the routes that he ran. Hopefully the absence of Johnny Smith's 7.44 targets per game on average from weeks 8 through 16 will develop in the direction of Jaylen Waddle and Tyreek Hill. Potentially, Darren Waller could be taking a lot of that opportunity share, but we all know that Jaylen Waddle, when healthy, is a good enough wide receiver when given ample opportunity. But that is the thing. He has lacked ample opportunity for multiple years here. Chris Olave is our number 37. Look, if the moment does arrive and he does sustain another concussion, he will probably have to retire. And that is incredibly unfortunate, but that is the situation. So, do we want to spend early round draft capital on a wide receiver that is one play away from potentially ending his career, or potentially a wide receiver that can stay healthy, who in 2022 and 2023 ranked as the number 25 and 16 overall wide receiver in a full PPR? Take the risk as it is. It's already baked into his current ADP. Why not take him where he's currently at? In which, again, he doesn't have to be your starter, but can come off of your bench. And even though he is associated with Shuck and Rattler, not great quarterback play, can certainly still be high potential for upside considering the offense that he's associated with. Matthew Golden's at number 38. Unfortunately, this morning, Jordan Love did undergo a surgery on his left hand. He is going to miss the remaining of training camp and hopefully be ready for week 1 against the Minnesota Vikings. But the Packers don't have a clear number 1 wide receiver, and we're hoping that Matthew Golden can step up and be exactly that this upcoming season, as the number 1 receiving option in terms of wide receivers last year for this offense was Jaden Reed, with a healthy Jordan Love, who only averaged 4.7 targets per game. So I am anticipating the number 1 overall pick of the Green Bay Packers to clear and away be the number 1 option here, and at a base minimum be in the top 40. Number 39 is Deebo Samuel. I'm still waiting on the determination of whether or not Terry McLaurin is going to be available and signed with the organization. If he is not, Deebo Samuel will jump in my rankings a significant margin, as he will be the number one touchdown threat within the receiving game outside of Zach Ertz. And of course, we know this offense is going to be scoring a boatload of touchdowns this upcoming season, thanks to the efforts of Jayden Daniels. The final quarterback I wanted to mention is a former teammate of Deebo Samuel, Jauan Jennings, who, once he returns from the calf injury, should be the number 2 receiving option in terms of wide receivers of this offense. But in terms of the pecking order of opportunity share, Pearsall, Kittle, McCaffrey, Jauan Jennings, who all of them will be healthy to begin the season, should be dominant threats within an offense that, again, is going to have themselves a lot of easy matchups going forward, should be able to light up a lot of defenses that they're facing. Early on, we have seen Jauan Jennings with Brock Purdy be a stud option and average 14 points per game together in a full PPR, and have even more potential for upside if the opportunity share continues to lean in his direction. All right, that's going to cover it for my top 40 wide receiver rankings for a full PPR scoring format as we approach our upcoming 2025 fantasy football drafts. If you guys enjoyed today's content and, of course, find it helpful for your upcoming drafts, click the like button down below. Subscribe if you have not yet already. I greatly appreciate all the support. Again, if you guys want my up-to-date rankings on a weekly basis for the remainder of the season, be sure to check out Betr. Like I mentioned earlier, all you have to do is use code Andrew, make that first-time deposit minimum of $10, and play $1 minimum within any of the sports categories, so potentially a preseason play, an MLB, WNBA, anything of that nature, potentially week 1 of the NFL season. You can go ahead and get ahead of yourself while the numbers are still a little bit skewed in our direction. Take advantage of that today. And of course, get my rankings sent from my email directly to yours. More information down in the description for those of you interested. That's going to cover it for me today. I'll be back tomorrow. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.